Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people to people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. In this episode, I have a wide-ranging conversation with Ken Hammond about the place of Chinese culture in the Chinese Revolution more broadly. We touch on the role of Confucianism in Chinese history and through different phases of the Chinese Revolution until today. We talk about language policy in China, the centralization of Pudonghua or Mandarin Chinese, how the study of Marxism has evolved in China over time, including until the present, as well as changing attitudes in China about the West. Ken Hammond is a professor at the Department of History at New Mexico State University. He is an expert in Chinese and East Asian history, having worked and lived in China for several periods over the past 40 years. He is the author of several books, including From Yao to Mao, 5,000 Years of Chinese History, and China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and like this video. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review to get this podcast to new audiences. Of course, you can and you should please share this podcast with others in your life. Word of mouth makes a huge difference. Lastly, if you're able to contribute small amounts of money or would like to be a monthly donor to this program, you can do that on Patreon. I've left that linked in the description below, in addition to, where you can find our Instagram and Substack. All right, without further ado, here's my conversation with Ken Hammond. All right, Ken, welcome to the International Solidarity Podcast. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here.
Of
Um,
course.
so, you know, um, where I want to get started today is I'm sure you'll know, and you've played a role in this over the past, couple of years, maybe past five-ish years or more. I think newer generations of people in the West, and particularly on the left, are, learning more about China, undoing sort of the Western propaganda that they learn about China. So that, there's been some kind of, I'm sure you'll agree that there's been some kind of progress on that front, learning about the realities of China. This often comes with reorienting around the basics, learning what the Chinese Revolution was, undoing the sort of propaganda and lies about authoritarianism and dictatorship, that kind of thing. So, having that established, I want our conversation here today to maybe go one layer deeper, I guess, and look at, a lot of folks are familiar now with China's revolutionary history. The history since uh, you know you can say 49, but then even before that, uh, starting 1911. I wanted to touch on some themes related to China's history before that, and
Hmm.
how it relates to how the Chinese see themselves today, as well as how the Communist Party orients itself today. So maybe the first thing I wanted to start with is um, in different phases of the Chinese Revolution, uh, it seems to me, and here's where you can come in and clarify this. It seems to me that there's been different attitudes toward China's pre-revolutionary history, particularly think about Confucianism. That's one theme. If I'm not wrong, during the Cultural Revolution, there were movements against Confucianism. I think today, Confucianism still plays a significant role in Chinese politics, how the Chinese see themselves. Do you think you can maybe start out by exploring that a little? How, what is the role of Confucianism, today in Chinese society, in the party, and how the party sees itself? How has that been different, throughout different phases of China's revolutionary history? And you feel free to touch on other themes from pre-revolutionary Chinese history as well, and how that's changed.
Sure. That's actually a really good thing to get into because I don't think we spend enough time engaging with topics quite like that. But that's actually a field I've done some work in. I did a book with a colleague from Kentucky about that a few years ago. Um, yeah, I mean Confucianism, of course, was the official orthodoxy of the imperial state, and that develops 2,000 plus years ago. Confucius was a thinker, I suppose you would say, an educator. He's often referred to by the Chinese people as the first teacher. Um, Lived about 2,500 years ago, and in a time of great turbulence in China, and his quest, I suppose you might say, was to figure out how Chinese society might return to a more stable order, and how people might learn to live together in a well-ordered, well-functioning society. And of course, over the years, different interpretations of his original teachings emerged, and as Confucianism becomes this very broad sort of discursive stream that had very, very diverse elements within it. But it was always engaged with the questions of good government and of caring for and sort of fulfilling the needs of the people, right? Confucianism, valued ritual, it valued harmony, it valued loyalty. There are a lot of things. I mean, it's a huge field, and we don't need to go too deep into all the nuts and bolts of that. But over many centuries, Confucianism, as it is adopted by the imperial state, it came to have kind of two, I think, principal aspects, and those are still in play today. One, which I think from sort of the official records that we have, the historical writings that we have that are produced, by the basically by the ruling classes in China, um, was the idea of order and harmony, and the idea that the state, the role of the state, the role of the emperor, but more importantly, the bureaucracy, was to keep people in their roles and sort of following, the leadership or the rules that prevailed. So that's a kind of top-down version of Confucianism that sees it as bringing order to the world. But there's also another sort of the flip side of that, in a sense, which was, Confucianism is an ethical order, and it's based the whole principles of good government that it articulates are based not on coercion, not on authority, but on example. The idea that the emperor, the officials, people in positions of leadership and authority should be good people. They should do the right thing. They should be, their primary motivation should not be themselves, but should be taking care of everybody else, helping people to care for themselves, promoting the livelihood and the welfare of everybody, and that to do that, they needed to be upright and have integrity and be ethical and all that kind of stuff. And so Confucianism also had this aspect of being critical, being something that could be invoked by what come to be thought of as righteous officials to criticize corrupt leadership or abuses of power and things like that. So it has this sort of dual aspect. In the 19th century, as Western imperialism began to dominate China, especially after the Opium War and the ongoing struggles to try to figure out how to cope with this new reality, this new menace. The imperial state grew increasingly weak and ineffective. It was too mired in its own traditions. The ruling classes had a remarkable inability to face reality and try to figure out what they had to do to cope with the modern world, the Western world. Um, And so many people who wanted to overcome Western imperialism, be able to resist it, be able to return China to its own sort of independent path, became quite critical of the official orthodoxies. And Confucianism is increasingly refuted, rejected, especially by the time we get down to 1911, the revolution that overthrows the imperial state, and then the struggles over the next few decades to try to come up with a new path forward. Confucianism was seen as a dead hand, a heavy weight that was holding the country back. And this is not something that's not a critique that emerges with Marxism and the Communist Party. This is something that was already developing, in the late 19th century. Certainly, the New Culture movement in the 19 teens, was very much concerned with that sort of rejection of Confucianism as something that was linked to the abuses of the past, and that top-down quality became the primary perception of Confucianism. And that persisted down through the revolution into the early years of the People's Republic, as you mentioned, during the Cultural Revolution. And especially, of course, it reaches its apex in many ways in 1972 or so with the campaign to criticize Lin Biao and Confucius, which was a very unusual and for many of us outside of China, and I think for many people even within China, kind of a puzzling association. Lin Biao, of course, had been one of the marshals of the Red Army. He had been a great fighter for the revolution. He had been very close to Chairman Mao, but because of, as best we can ascertain, differences in opinion about the primary contradiction in the world, whether it was between China and American imperialism or between China and what they characterized as Soviet social imperialism. And Mao and Lin seem to have come to opposite conclusions about that, and Lin apparently acted to try to take out the chairman and wound up, trying to flee to Russia and gets his plane crashes in Mongolia. And it remains somewhat a murky episode, but clearly Lin Biao he went from, hero to zero, as they say, and then gets hooked up somehow with this idea of Confucianism. So that's kind of the most intense moment of that. And then it kind of fades away again. And of course, when we get to the period of reform and opening, starting in 1979, say, there are a lot of other priorities on the plate. But as reform advanced through the 80s and beyond, one of the contradictions that emerged within the overall process of the reform policies was corruption. Corruption had not been much of a problem. It's not that there weren't some abuses of power in the first 30 years, but not the kind of corruption and not certainly the extent of the corruption that emerges, with the adoption of market mechanisms as a driving force for economic development. And so, given that context, there's kind of a revival of the more bottom-up aspects of Confucianism. And we get in the 90s, in the early 21st century, and this continues down to the present day, we get Confucianism is back. We see statues of Confucius appearing. One outside the Revolutionary Museum in Tiananmen Square, and there are programs on television. A woman writer becomes very popular with her books about Confucianism, sort of popular Confucianism. You go in the bookstores or even the supermarkets in China, you'd see her books stacked up there, and Confucianism returns in a very interesting way. There are efforts, and these also are ongoing by the state and by the party to also re-emphasize not so much that top-down quality, but the idea of harmony. We hear a lot about harmonious society and all that, and that's drawn a lot from Confucianism. And these days, one of the things that we hear in the public discourse in the political conversations is this idea of there being this dialectic between modern revolutionary theory, if you will, Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought, of course, um, and the traditions of the Chinese past. And so I think that the role of Confucianism now is it's sort of not in its totality, not all the aspects of it, but the more progressive, if you will, aspects of it have become part of that political conversation, have become part of the sense of how, what we hear a lot, socialism with Chinese characteristics. Well, part of those Chinese characteristics are the positive ethical values, the critical attitude towards power, the emphasis on ethics and integrity and uprightness, that can be drawn out of Confucian discourse across, the last 2,500 years. So I think that it's a very fundamental component of things that I don't think is necessarily all that well understood, even by a lot of people who are very supportive of China. I think that you have to dig a little deeper to get to that particular strain within the process.
Thanks for that, Ken. That was great, and I feel like I learned a lot. I mean, part of this as well is that I'm not even as familiar with um, you know, some of these elements of Chinese history. I wanted to ask you maybe before we move on if there were any other, because I brought up Confucianism, and because of my own ignorance, there might be other things, other themes, other elements throughout all of 5,000 years of Chinese history. Are there other themes that you think are maybe worth delving into in terms of um, you know established traditions over years and then coming into question with the Chinese Revolution, and then taking sort of a shifting back and forth in the same way the relationship was with Confucianism? Are there any other themes like that that come to mind for you that you think might be worth going into? And if not, this was just an open question that I thought I'd ask, and if not, we can move on. But yeah.
Yeah, no, actually there's another whole field. Scholarly attention. There have been a couple of good books published on this.
Sorry, Ken.
Um,
I lost your audio for a second. Could you just start again? I didn't hear the first part of what you said.
sure, yeah, no, just that's also there are other certainly other themes, and one in particular that I think has been important recently, has been getting a certain amount of scholarly attention here in the West and certainly within China, has to do with political economy. Ideas about political economy, about how the economy should function, what the relationship should be between the state and the economy, things like that. Um, and of course that's also embedded in various ways and certainly articulated in Chinese history through the sort of cultural field, if you will, of Confucianism, because of Confucianism's role as the orthodoxy of the imperial state. But the political economic discourse draws on a lot of other elements as well. And basically, it boils down, there's a debate that takes place around the year 80 BCE, okay, in the Han Dynasty. Um, After the reign of one of the great emperors, Emperor Wu of the Han Wudi, and he had been a very activist emperor and a very hands-on emperor, and had adopted a number of policies creating imperial monopolies in certain fundamental commodities, salt, alcohol, iron, things like that. Um, and after he died, a debate took place at court about those policies and to what extent they should be maintained and to what extent they maybe should be rescinded. And it essentially articulates a kind of they would, of course, didn't use this terminology, but a kind of a free market version versus a more state interventionist model. Okay. And the arguments are based on questions of profiteering and private interest. Is that something that should be encouraged or prohibited or discouraged at least? Versus the idea that society, the people should be trusted to run their own affairs. Of course, as is often the case with politicians, when they refer to the people, what they mean is elites, but So it's a question of sort of class autonomy or state intervention to protect ordinary people from the depredations of market forces, things like that. And that debate becomes just a classical text. People still refer to it. There's another, and this goes on, through succeeding centuries, this debate, including especially in the 11th century, in the beginning of the Sung Dynasty, when China was going through a very rapid period of commercial development, commodity production, monetization, just a very elaborate. I've written some about this. I view it as sort of China's own version, early version of commercial capitalism. And there's a renewed debate about the role of the state. A figure named Wang Anshi articulates a set of new, he becomes prime minister and articulates a set of policies designed to have the state be very actively engaged, trying to constrain profiteering and things like that. And he's opposed by figures, particularly a guy called Sima Guang, who argue that the state should keep its hands off and let market forces and private interests sort of work out their best options and all this. So these kind of debates, which obviously resonate with political economy in 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century West, um, these are part of the Chinese tradition as well, and those have been harkened back to. As I say, there have been numerous books that have been coming out and articles coming out about political economy, political theory, economic theory in Imperial China that have really brought together the writings of all kinds of figures over these couple thousand years um, that translated into English and all that, and I think that has helped us to have a more nuanced understanding that obviously the old ideas of what they used to call Oriental despotism, that Imperial China was just this monstrous state where the emperor could have everybody's heads cut off if he wanted. It's just a caricature. But just as that feeds stereotypes in the West, you can trot out this authoritarian rhetoric and say Xi Jinping is just a dictator and all that kind of stuff because of these kind of racist attitudes about Chinese history, about the Chinese past. Well, what do you expect? I mean, they have this long thousands of years of horrible, authoritarian power and everything. And of course, it isn't true for the imperial period, and it isn't true for the present period. In both periods, the question is, what's the class nature of Chinese society and economy? And that makes all the difference in the world. So but that's certainly another whole area of interest. And of course, there's questions with Buddhism and Taoism, the sort of spiritual traditions. Those are back and lively in China today. I don't think they play quite the same role in public discourse and certainly in political discourse that either Confucianism or political economy do. But of course, Buddhism, for example, very greatly emphasizes the ideas of compassion. And I think that's something that is in some ways incorporated into political discourse as well. So drawing, as I say, this sort of dialectical relationship between modern, Marxist, Leninist theoretical propositions as an analytical methodology and all that, and seeing what there is of value in the Chinese traditions, and they say making the old serve the new, there's I think there's a pretty good consciousness about that in the writings of all kinds of interesting political and intellectual figures on the scene in China these days.
That was great. Thanks for that again, Kim.
Sure,
Um,
sure.
yeah, no, I mean, I maybe wanted to get a little bit now, just switching gears a little into your own experiences in China. You, I think, first went to China in the 80s, if I'm not wrong. Um,
1982.
Okay, nice. And I'm very interested in your impressions of how things have changed, and I plan to get to that. I wanted to ask you what was your experience learning Chinese, and how did that go? I mean, and how long did it take you to become fluent? And I assume since you're a scholar as well, and you engage with scholarly material in China as well, your reading and writing must be pretty decent as well. I mean, maybe briefly on that, I because I'm curious. Might be a selfish question as well. I mean, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the education system in Hong Kong, but non-Chinese students, we don't learn Cantonese, but we're especially in this period since the handover, we have to learn Putonghua as well and Mandarin. But it's unfortunate, but um, the maximum level at which we get is not that high. And so I'm also looking to sort of improve my Mandarin as well. But as a foreigner, as someone from the West, who went to China in a very different time and now continues to engage um, with people at a cultural level, at a regular level, but also at the scholarly level. I'm sort of just wondering what your experiences with that has been.
Yeah, well, it it is learning Chinese for a foreigner is certainly I'm always struck by Chairman Mao's concept of protracted war, that it is a long and never ending process, and people say, well, how long did it take you to become fluent? And uh, as Zhou Enlai said of the French Revolution, it's too soon to tell, I mean, it's still a work in progress. you know. But yeah, I went to Beijing in 1982. I had started trying to learn Chinese as an undergrad in 1969 in a very kind of ironic situation, given both that present moment and certainly my ongoing life, which was that in the context of the Cold War and especially during the period of Vietnam, the CIA used to run this thing they called the Critical Languages Program. And this was designed to, you know, certainly provide educational opportunities for people in languages that weren't kind of the mainstream in American higher education. And one of those, of course, was Chinese. They wanted people to learn Chinese, and then, their talent spotters would sort of pick out people and try to recruit them in. And we had a guy in the political science department at Kent that was their spotter on our campus and everything. And so I started, I signed up. I wanted to take Chinese. I didn't know or really at that point care a lot about the background. I didn't know that it was a CIA thing. I learned that later. Um, and it was a funny little program because the instructors were these ladies who were the wives of Taiwanese engineers who were in the nearby industrial town of Akron, Ohio, working for the big rubber companies, Firestone, Goodyear, Goodrich, like that. And they brought their wives along, and the wives didn't have a lot to do, so they uh, they got to pick up some money by teaching people to speak Chinese. And it was basically just conversational. We didn't really learn to read characters or anything. And that went on for, about a year. And of course, then in spring of 1970, everything that happened at Kent in those days, that was the end of that for me. So I had just a little bit of a background. And then in 82, I had the chance to go and I went over. And that summer of 82, I was in an intensive language program, we're just at the very beginning level in Beijing. And it was intense. I mean, we would have class for 4 hours in the morning from 8 to noon, and then the rest of the day you'd to be doing your homework, writing stuff out, memorizing characters, and it was a crunch. We tried to memorize 50 characters a day, and because it's just learning to read is just brute memorization. I mean, it's just you just got to cram them in. And that went on. That was a 9-week program, and it was was intense. When I finished that, the American organization that ran the program, a thing called CET based in Boston, they offered me a position, a staff position, in China, working not so much with that language program, but what they also sent educational delegations to China. And I spent the next 4.5 years basically being the advance man for these different groups that would come from America. I had medical records technicians, I had beekeepers, I had paper makers who wanted to come to China and meet their counterparts, learn about their particular interest. So my job was to travel around in advance of their itineraries and find things for them to do that weren't part of the normal tourist experience, which was a fantastic job. I lived for those 4.5 years with a dictionary in one hand, you know, because I had to learn all this insane vocabulary and I was just they just dropped me out there in the provinces and I had 9 weeks of intensive first year Chinese. I mean, come on. But, learn by doing. And so I crunched it. And then when I came back to the States in 87 to start graduate school, they do these placements. And, I placed great in spoken Chinese, but I couldn't freaking read for the life of me. So I wound up, they figured out a niche to put me in, and that was fine. And then of course, that was intensive learning to read. And then, of course, I had to learn classical Chinese. Um, yeah, so it's an ongoing thing. I have tried in the 40 years or so since all that to be back in China as much as possible. I've been there on research grants. I've been there to teach. I sometimes used to take American um, groups over and like do introductory talks for them and everything, just to constantly be in the language environment, you know. Yeah, so I mean, it's one of those things. For any language, the best way to really master it is to be in the language environment. And so I've, tried to keep up with that. And it's one of those things where when I get back to the country, this was true this past summer. I was there in July for a couple weeks. First few days are pretty rough. And then a little bit, it'll start to be more comfortable. And about the time I'm ready to leave and come home, I feel like, oh yeah, I can speak this language. So it's in there, but if you're not in an environment where you use it regularly, it rusts a bit. And when you get back there, you have to kind of polish it up.
Nice, yeah. There's a lot I could reflect off of that. Maybe we'll do it after the recording's done. But yeah, no. Okay, no, I mean we're talking about language here, and I sort of wanted to pivot this into a broader, well, my next question about language in China, because after um and correct me if some of my history here is wrong, but after, the Chinese Revolution, after the establishment of New China in 49, not too long after that, that's when you have Mandarin becoming sort of the national language, and I guess over time, over the decades, increasingly so. And I come at this question, I mean, that I grew up in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong, people speak Cantonese. And it's interesting, I've done school trips. I've had gone to the mainland several times, and I've even been to rural areas of Guangdong. And, the students there at, these rural schools are surprised that, non-Chinese people like myself can speak Cantonese, or Yue as they call it, but they can't, or it's still like, they can hear it, they can listen to it, they can understand it, but their Mandarin is much better. Um,
Sure.
so how do you see? I guess what I'm getting at here is, and of course, I sort of see this as well from my Indian background. In India, it's a very different case, right? You have each state has its own language. there's more or less there's a lot of resistance against imposition of Hindi, from the
Sure,
central
sure.
government, especially in the southern states. Um, Versus, this has been more or less accomplished in China, the universalization of Mandarin, even other dialects like the Fujian dialect, the Shanghainese, uh, you know, even Cantonese, in the mainland, you still get it, but to a much lesser extent. Um, have there been tensions with this? Has this been sort of a smooth process? What is the thinking here behind universalizing Mandarin? And then, of course, t- forgive me if I'm going in all sorts of directions. There are also, national minority languages, right? Like Uyghur and, like the Tibetan languages. And I think in those cases, there's been, a lot more effort at preserving that, having, dual track in school where you can learn Tibetan and Mandarin at the same time and Uyghur and Mandarin at the same time, that kind of thing. Give us your sense of how the central government in China is managing this and what the historical approach has been with language, because that's a tricky one, right? I mean, it's still to this day, Cantonese speakers talk about how Cantonese is a much older language, it's much deeper, it's much more philosophical, and some of those things don't get contained within Mandarin and the simplified script and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I know it's a big question, but give us your sense of that.
No, language, is a really critical area, and the this process that you're talking about, the sort of relationship between Mandarin or Putonghua, the common language, um, and local dialects, is one that has not developed in a linear way. It has gone through some very distinct phases, shall we say. And I think that those are comprehensible. Um, but we need to recognize that these phases have existed. I think that right after liberation, there were two priorities, or kind of one priority with two aspects, perhaps, um, which was that you know to build the new China. Um, what you wanted was to have everybody on board, to have a common program, to have a common endeavor, to have people working together to overcome, the devastation that had been wreaked on the economy and the destruction from warfare and all the displaced people and all this kind of stuff. And so the development of a sort of nationwide communications network, radio being at the core of that at first, but television slowly being developed, but increasingly a presence. Um, and at that point, what that meant, what they did, was to, that the people who would appear on television, the people providing the news, the people, enacting, the dramas or whatever that were going to be broadcast on the radio, um, they spoke basically Northern Mandarin, not the Beijing dialect, which has got its own peculiarities, but sort of, basically Northern Mandarin. When that is standardized as Putonghua, right? And so in that period, and this goes on, for probably the first 30 years, um, that standard it becomes the national language. Sometimes, it's referred to as Guoyu, the national spoken language. Um, and okay, and that obviously that worked. Movies were made where everybody spoke Putonghua, even though the characters, might in reality have been people who spoke Min or Yue or Hakka or whatever, But in order to have a common discourse, Putonghua was what was used. And the corollary of that was the simplification of the characters because the Fantiza, the complicated, old complicated characters, uh, they're tougher for people to read, more strokes to write, more. I'm just looking, I have the Hanyu Datsudian right here, so I'm just looking at that and thinking, oh my God, But simplifying the characters, which was a process that had been going on since the early 20th century. I mean, the New Culture movement, the Baihua, the plain language movements in literature and all that. They had been working on this on the simplified characters. Some of the simplified characters, of course, are adopted from Japanese, where they had done that long ago, as they were adapting characters to spoken Japanese. But the idea of the simplification was to make it easier for people to learn to read, right? To broaden access to written materials. And again, that's part of trying to create this sort of national discourse to be able to communicate information and ideas and policies and all this to people all across the country. And of course, throughout history, one of the things that gave China an actual existence was the fact that there was this common written language. Even with the great diversity of spoken dialects, everybody who could read the same characters. So now with the simplification, you're going to broaden that out. So both the sort of adoption of Putonghua and the simplification of the characters. These are efforts at, if you will, a kind of democratization of language, right? But then, interestingly, this happens roughly in tandem with the adoption of policies of reform and opening. Those, by that point, and as China accumulates more social wealth and more sort of available resources, each province starts to develop their own telecommunications, their own TV channels, things like that. So, you travel in China, and this was true. This isn't brand new right now. This was true probably even 20 years ago. If you're staying in a hotel someplace and you turn on the TV, there's like 100 channels, and a lot of them are like CCTV and or other Mandarin speaking things. But you can watch Fujian television, you can watch Yunnan television, and a lot of that programming is in dialect. You know which isn't to say that I mean, nobody is saying that Putonghua isn't going to remain the national language. There has to be a unified, integrated spoken language, so that people can I mean, I don't speak. I can understand some Shanghai and some Guangdonghua, but I can't produce any of that. So it's important that when people are traveling around, that they be able to communicate with one another. And that has its roots, of course, back in the imperial system, with the reason that classical Chinese was always maintained. Because Wenyan, the spoken version of classical Chinese, functioned as Latin did in medieval Europe, that was the unifier. That, the officials, people who passed the exams, they all could participate in the classical language, even though growing up in different parts of the empire, they would have spoken their local dialects. So that unified the imperial state system. And now Putonghua functions to unify, sort of the national ecumeny, if you will, and the greater access through simplified characters. But there's been this sort of re-embrace, a new enthusiasm. And I spent a fair amount of time in Shanghai. I spent some time teaching down there and working down there. Um, you hear a lot of Shanghai on the streets. And of course, often you find yourself in a situation where maybe you're in a shop or a restaurant or something, and the fuyuan, the staff people, they'll respond to you in Mandarin. But when they talk amongst themselves, they're speaking, local dialect, and you got to wonder what are they saying? They, listen to this bozo, something like that. I mean, it's something that is empowering for people, and I think that's great, and I think that the diversity, if you will, the language diversity is something that you don't really want to lose in China. And of course, the same thing, you mentioned, not to go too far down this path, but um, with the ethnic minorities, um, there's this whole messaging in the West about, cultural genocide and all this kind of crap. And all you have to do is go to Lhasa or Shigatse or Gyaltse in Tibet, and the signage, the things people are saying. I studied Tibetan for a while, and I don't speak it very well, but I can tell that people are speaking Tibetan. Um, you go out to Xinjiang, and I don't have any Uyghur. I know how to make a toast, and that's about it. Um, but there's the signage again, and people in the markets and everything. Yeah, come on. And if you look at the bookstores and the newsstands, there's plenty of Tibetan or Uyghur. I took Manchu in graduate school to do research in the Qing archives, and out in Xinjiang, one of the local dialects there, Shibo, is a Manchu. It's Manchu basically, and it's written in the old Manchu script and everything. You see Manchu publications, so they face that challenge with the whole aspects of minority policies of preservation without isolation. You want to keep those cultures intact within their own dynamics while offering the bearers of those cultures, those people, the opportunities to be integrated in the national enterprise, which means, of course, that Uyghur people are also going to learn Chinese. They're also going to learn Putonghua. It's not that, their language, their culture is being destroyed, but more options are being opened up, And so it's again, there's those dual aspects of it, just as with Putonghua and simplified characters.
That's great. I want to move now toward talking about uh, Marxism, the study of Marxism in China. I have two more questions left, Ken, and you let me know if you have to basically give me a sense of when you would have to go and if you have a hard stop. But maybe the first question here is, in your estimation, how has the study of Marxism um, changed, evolved over time in China? I'm sure you're familiar, and I've heard as well of folks from the New Left in China saying that since the Reform period, the study of Marxism is slightly different, and then now since 2014, since the new era, you have a reinvigoration of the study of Marxism in workplaces, at schools and universities, if I'm understanding this correctly. Um, how do you understand these changes in studying Marxism over time, and what is the emphasis today? How ubiquitous is it today? How useful is it for those learning it? What is the attitude toward it as well?
Yeah, I mean, boy, that's a hot button item with me. I was in China in 2016 teaching a seminar for graduate students in history at Hebei Normal University in Shijiazhuang. And I just maybe the second or third day of class, it began to be obvious to me that they had not read Marx, and I asked them, I said, I mean, I was kind of surprised to say the least. I said, "Look, you guys are supposed to be communists. What the hell, How is it that you haven't read the manifesto, you haven't read 18th Brumaire, you haven't read Civil War in France. What the heck's going on here, And they were like, "Oh, well, we know about those. We've read so- like the Cliff Notes version, they've read these sort of um, I don't know, abstracts or summaries, whatever you want to call them. that's what they were exposed to. And I have to say, I was kind of horrified. And a couple of years later, I was at a conference about China, actually in London at School of Oriental and African Studies. And this topic came up, and other people were commenting the same thing, that they'd had these various experiences about what the hell's going on with Marxist education in China, and we were all like, whoa.
This was which year again?
Well, my experience, that was 2016.
Okay, got it. Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, continue.
And it's in 2018, while this conversation was taking place in London, but that's when the push to establish these schools of Marxism begins. And now there's over 1,000 of them at different institutions of higher education across China. Basically every place is supposed to have one now. And of course, the very famous story of Xi Jinping having the members of the political bureau do a study session on the manifesto. I love that. I just think that's great. I remember when I heard that, I thought, right on. So I think that what's happened, or if we want to trace the longer dynamic of that, is that in those first 30 years or so, the there was a lot of political education, reading Chairman Mao, the Red Book, all that kind of stuff. Um, and then there's an attitude, I think, as we shift into the period of reform, that there's an attitude that people were kind of worn out. People were kind of exhausted by that. Obviously, the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution had been intense, and as the new leadership was sort of consolidating its position, getting these really profound reforms underway, I think there was a sense that they wanted to get on with the work. They wanted to get on with the tasks, and it certainly involved still a lot of education, much of which was in fact political. But a lot of that involved, studying the experience of Western economies, studying markets. Lots of translations. If you went into the bookstores in the 90s, especially, they were filled with translations of Western economic writing and management theory and all this kind of stuff. And I think that for a while, that sort of eclipsed more specifically Marxist engagements, right? And that, of course, goes in tandem with this idea that Deng Xiaoping articulated, that during this period of reform, when China needed access to capital and ideas and technologies from the West, that it was important to keep a low profile. Bide your time, build your capabilities. That's what Deng Xiaoping said about how China should advance. So there was a kind of, not that they stopped talking about socialism and building all that, but it's kind of de-emphasized, kind of a lower profile, during this period, what I call the period of accommodation with world capitalism and with American imperialism. And I think that the this sort of low tide of Marxist education was an aspect of that, a corollary of that. But of course, with the new era, with the leadership of Xi Jinping, um, that's changing. It has changed profoundly. And I think that there has been, exactly as the term you used is the one I like, a reinvigoration of the study of Marxism. And I'll tell you, I was only there for a week, but uh, the School of Marxism at Shandong University, it has its own building, it has its own library, which is very well stocked. It has hundreds of students, and this summer school brought in students not who weren't necessarily majoring in Marxism, but they were engineers, or there were a couple of our sort of art history students and, philosophy, but they were all interested. They thought it was, interesting and worthwhile for them to be taking this Marxist summer school. So I think there's been a real reinvigoration and a real re-engagement with that. And that's part, I think, of overcoming I think you may be familiar with the work of Wang Hui, who wrote a wonderful book called Depoliticized Politics, which is about how in the 90s, um, many people in China kind of backed off from politics. They didn't see politics as something that they needed to be directly engaged with. On the one hand, that's because they were trying to do their jobs, trying to make a living, trying to raise their families, you know. And on the other hand, it was that, well, we trust the party, we trust the government. Let those people who want to be involved with politics, let them do it, and we'll just go about our business. And of course, that's certainly understandable, but it's also dangerous. And I think that as under Xi Jinping's leadership, there's been a more aggressive grappling with the contradictions of, that have emerged in the course of reform, particularly inequality, wealth distribution, things like that, as well as corruption. Um, that they're really struggling to get a grip, and they don't want emerging bourgeois elements. They don't want, I mean, China has billionaires. We don't want them coming to constitute a political force, you know. They've got the market has to be controlled, restrained, guided by the party and the state. And so, in order to effect that, it's important that both within the party and in the society more broadly, the dynamics of capitalism and the threat that it poses need to be upfront. And so Marxist education is one, but a very important one of the mechanisms to utilize to pursue that.
Yeah, and I guess just some reflections here, especially for those of us in the West. You know, I was going to say perhaps particularly among younger generations of Marxists or newly coming to Marxism, but not necessarily, right? I'm at university and doing my PhD, and there are several of these Western Marxists who might decry China for diluting Marxism or betraying revolutionary ideals, that kind of thing. But what I think what you've laid out there is that instead of deferring to, which is what I see more broadly as a philosophical tendency in Western thinking, is to overly sort of moralize things and to see things in an idealistic kind of way.
Yeah,
The shifts between the attitude to Marxism really reflects the material foundation, right? I mean, after the during the reform and opening up, there was a dire need to develop the productive forces at perhaps a more accelerated rate than before to catch up. Poverty is, and that's the thing, right? People in the West don't understand low levels of development and poverty. And I think that's where this comes from. So when you're in the global south and you're trying to develop your country, that is a non-negotiable. I guess they might, maybe a generous way of seeing it is as an unfortunate byproduct of needing to develop first, and then some of the more ideological or revolutionary elements of this get put to the back burner. But then you have opportunities like this where once the material foundation has transformed and evolved over time, then you see change accordingly as well. And I think that sort of brings me nicely, transitions well to my last question here, um, about prospects for, well, there's already conflict and confrontation between the U.S., especially in China, but you can say the West more broadly in China. But I wanted to ask, and correct me if I'm wrong here. Tell me if your impressions are different, but I think the U.S. and the West played quite a big role, obviously, in China's reform and opening up period, in China, developing from what it was in the 60s, 70s, 80s till it is today. And so with that, as you're saying, came a lot of bourgeois ideology, Western kind of ways of thinking, byproducts of the market mechanism, to the point where I wonder if, and here's where you can correct me. I wonder if there might be, and I don't know what the party is thinking, but among regular folks in China, I wonder if there's an element of underestimating how irrational and how racist and how aggressive the West can actually be, and especially as it relates to the prospects of war. I think, that there's an understanding of the history of Japanese imperialism in China, and the havoc that wreaked on China, and what place that holds in history. But I wonder if, because of this combined development between the West and China, um, you know, you will know that many in China will still see the West as developed and as rational. So, how do you see this in terms of, because from my perspective as a Westerner, as someone who's critical of the West, understands the settler colonial history of the West, and westward expansion, and all this kind of stuff, you can really see how aggressive, expansionist, racist the Western system of capitalism is, and has brought us to this particular moment. Do you feel like there needs to be, do you feel like there's a solid understanding of it? Do you feel like there's this need for a kind of shift? Yeah, I'm just curious about that in terms of prospects for war and conflict with China, and how people in China, is this reorienting how they see the West?
Yeah, I think that attitudes towards the West have gone through a lot of changes. You know, when I first was in Beijing back in 82, um, it was all that was so brand new. I mean, even in the big cities, people did not they weren't used to seeing Westerners, and certainly not Americans, kind of just out on the streets, right? And I never encountered hostility, you know, but a lot of curiosity and a lot of, just like it was like having the aliens land or something. Um, and that continued to develop into a real sort of idealization or romanticization of the West. That that we were rich, and everybody had all this stuff, and just this view of the West that was unrealistic. But obviously, what most ordinary people in China knew came from the relatively small number of films, for example, Western films that they got to see. And as that opened up and more Western media came in, of course, the presentations that you see on TV shows, TV even more than film, are pretty distorted. We're so used to it. Think of a show. I just came across some wisecrack about this recently, like the show Friends. It said, how do these people that seem to work casual gig jobs afford these huge apartments in Greenwich Village? I mean, it's completely unrealistic. It has no connection to the actual lived lives. But that doesn't bother us, because we know that it's just a story and it's a setting and blah blah blah. And that's always been true with Western media. It presents this image, um, and that's what a lot of ordinary people came to think was real. They thought shows like Dallas, were real. And as things opened up, and as more, especially more students, more young people began to come to the West, come to the United States to study, their experiences were a little different. They began to see a little more of the realities here. But even there, for a long time, the universities gave them a lot of support, and I think that their experiences were pretty positive. But I remember, I think it must have been in the 90s. There were a couple of television shows that became popular in China, Chinese television shows that were about Chinese who had come to America. There was one I remember especially about a Chinese family that had settled in Los Angeles, opened a restaurant, and the challenges of that. And you know, it was very realistic, and it became wildly popular because people began to say, "Oh, that's what it's really like." And I think that there continued to be for a long time this kind of romanticization. But now, of course, and really this starts to change with with the crisis, the financial crisis in 2008. And then, of course, it really accelerated with COVID, right? And with all the stuff that goes, the South China Sea, Taiwan, all the stuff. People in China know what Western media is saying about their country, and they're baffled by this gap and what they see increasingly as kind of hatred, and I think now that for many people, obviously not for everybody, but I think for probably most people, the rose-colored glasses are a thing of the past, and I think there is a more realistic appreciation of the fact that the United States is capable of really bad behavior. And we just had this, the September 3rd parade to commemorate the anniversary of the end of the war against the war of resistance against Japanese aggression. Um, and you know, I think that's a message. It's a message to the outside world, but it's also a message domestically that we can deal with this. We can handle this. We're gonna devote the resources that we need to making sure that we can care for the country, that we can protect ourselves. And I think that increasingly people have a sense that that's a real thing, that there is a need for China to protect itself, that you know, the United States is not, it's not the land of milk and honey, and it's not the political elites. I mean, there's not hostility towards the American people. There's not the kind of racist attitudes towards foreigners that we have towards everybody else on the planet. But there's also, I think, an increasing recognition that American elites are scared. They're losing their dominant position, their global hegemony, and their that kind of fear and anxiety makes them irrational, and that's very, very dangerous. And especially now, of course, Christ Almighty, the Trump administration, especially the second one, is just so out of control and so completely unhinged that I think people in China, I mean, when I was there in July, everybody was like, what the heck, and what do you say, it's the result of our corrupt system, and I don't know what is going to happen with it, but it's very, very dangerous and very, very reckless. And the Chinese, I think there's an increasing, very widespread recognition and I think people are pretty well connected to that reality.
I appreciate that, Ken. I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you very
Sure.
much for your time.